Hello, this is Group A's policy analysis on sea level rise in Florida. The coast of Florida is at high risk of sea level rising and flooding due to the impacts of climate change. We will go over the different stakeholders, competing claims, and what can be done at the local, state, and federal government levels.
When North America was colonized by Europeans over 200 years ago, towns and cities took root near water bodies along the eastern seaboard. Development in these areas provided essential elements to human survival, including food, transportation, drinking water, and irrigation for agriculture. Tributaries and riverbanks and streams had fertile soils and served as commerce and transportation routes. Oceanic harbor areas provided space for large ships and were full of life-sustaining food items like mussels, oysters, clams, shrimp, crabs, lobster, and thousands of fish species. The concept of sea level rise as cities and towns were populated and our nation formalized its governance didn't exist. At the time, the new citizens of these coastal areas would not have had an understanding of tropical storms, the causes of flash flooding, or the experience of catastrophic storm events like today's hurricanes. The concentration of development in similar areas has occurred worldwide, with some areas taking great measures to create footprints, even in submerged areas. These areas, like the Netherlands and Venice, are now undeniably the most vulnerable to the effects of sea level rise. Over the last 30 to 40 years, scientists have begun sounding the alarm for local, national, and world leaders to acknowledge projected changes in the Earth's climate that contributes to sea level rise. This change in climate threatens the health and well-being of people, communities, infrastructure, wildlife populations, agriculture, and the sustainability necessary to support future generations. At the time, these projections were based on trends involving human-caused effects such as CO2 emissions, air pollution, and changes in agricultural practices. These projections were met with defensiveness and skepticism, often labeling scientists as alarmists. Part of the issue surrounding the transfer of information from academia and science-based processes to political platforms is that the two possess very different cultural, structural, and operating mechanisms. What seems apparent to scientists through data collection and analysis involving variables, certainties, and hypotheses collected over many years may not be accurately received by politicians and leaders who operate from perspectives that must represent the collective or majority views of their constituents and associated political platforms. During the 1970s and 1980s, the public was just starting to acknowledge issues like public health and limited natural resources as real concerns, though decades of research had indicated the limits to specific resources being consumed or harmed in unsustainable ways. It wasn't until public perception changed and pressure was placed on the politicians representing the majority that changes in policy and law began to be realized, sometimes too late to prevent long-term negative consequences.
The values and interests in this area lie tremendously with the residents and property owners in high flood zone areas. When people have property in this area, it not only lowers the value of their home, but they also have to pay in hazard insurance as well. And then local and state governments are also facing challenges when it comes to paying for rebuilding and reconstruction after a large storm where there was flooding involved. Then there's stormwater management and emergency responses that are also very expensive. And ultimately, the taxpayers are the ones paying for that. State and federal government are dealing with high demands for disaster relief, infrastructure, and insurance programs. And then there's the health of the public. When there are large flood areas and low-lying areas, they're at high risk for waterborne illness spreading due to flooding. And again, these areas are most vulnerable to those who are low income and elderly.
Government leaders must represent the interests of their constituents, and scientists must represent the data. These two operating platforms often do not align at the same time or in the same way. The issues of climate change and sea level rise has been no different than other paradigm shifts required to elicit change in policies and laws created to protect the common good, other than the time that's needed for public acceptance. Some paradigm shifts come more quickly than others. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic appeared globally and was acknowledged quickly due to the virus's rapid spread and direct and immediate effects on health. The impacts of climate change and the resulting sea level rise are not as readily seen and therefore have taken more time to increase concern and garner public acceptance. This public acceptance has grown as the impacts from climate change and sea level rise have affected communities through increased flooding events, intensification of storm events, wildfires, and other environmental shifts linked to climate change. Communities and local governments most affected have begun to implement policies and allocate funding to these issues in an effort to minimize financial impacts, ensure public health and safety, and provide critical infrastructure. A concern is whether or not these responses have come too late or will be enough, as the effects of rise in sea level are now regularly impacting coastal communities.
Stakeholders play a role in the decision-making process as well. Decision makers, as politicians, are representatives of their constituents. As a representative, the constituent's opinion is vital to take into consideration while making policy decisions, so they continue to garner support from the people they represent. Constituents present their needs in various ways to the representatives in hopes that their voice will be heard in the decision-making process. The business industry is represented by lobbyists who argue for the company's interests. They attempt to ensure favorable conditions for the business operations and to minimize any negative impact to those companies with possible policies. The scientific community also plays a role as stakeholders. Many organizations and individuals are environmentalists, ecologists, activists, and advocates for causes. These professionals provide the vital information and data collected to be used for policy and decision making. The decision-making process occurs after the problem has been defined, research has been performed, and possible solutions have been identified. The best solution for the problem must be decided upon and a policy put into place. Depending on the level of government that the process is taking place at, the roles differ for the various agencies involved. Federal agencies produce guidelines for the state and local governments to follow. The agencies at this level provide oversight and even evaluations of compliance with the policies. Examples of these agencies could be the EPA or the NOAA Hurricane Center. State agencies take the guidelines into account and develop requirements for the local level of government. This level is also a major proponent in disaster response and recovery assistance. Local governments develop policies for hazard mitigation, whether it's from disaster preparedness to building permits, to building codes, and even zoning of geographical areas in order to best prevent property loss. Local governments often requisition information in order to effectively make policy decisions. There are other organizations involved as well. They may be involved by performing research to collect the important information that's utilized to propose solutions and considered by the policymakers when finalizing their decisions.
Regarding sea level rise, varying beliefs exist on the responses needed. These differences vary in whether it is a state or federal issue, the extent and urgency of the problem, and the solutions required to address the issue. The claims are as follows. Claim 1. Sea level rise needs to be urgently addressed by the federal government. Experts argue that sea level rise is a very urgent issue and needs a stronger, widespread response from the federal government. Page 2024 states, local governments and states are not fully equipped with the proper resources and funding to address the issue of sea level rise. Overall, it is the federal government's responsibility to step in and provide a strong, uniform response to sea level rise by providing financial resources and guiding and implementing policy. Claim 2. Sea level rise is a serious problem and needs a mixed approach at the local, state, and federal levels. Page 2024 also argues that sea level rise is not occurring gradually, but rather in intense fits and starts and needs to be effectively addressed. According to a report in 2010 by Florida Oceans and Coastal Council, sea level rise has increased exponentially from the 19th to the 20th century and has even risen 80% faster than the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Third Assessment Report predicted it would. Florida Oceans and Coastal Council 2010 also state an issue with the changing data presenting in the homes and buildings that were built on Florida's coastline following the mean sea level and flooding referencing from the National Geodetic Vertical Datum of 1929. The following statistics show that the majority of homes in Florida were not built to deal with the current or future sea level rise. This data presents the argument that due to the diversity of different coastal areas regarding the geography, climate, and property rights, a mixed approach at the federal, state, and local levels is needed. Overall, a standard and uniform approach would not be beneficial for diverse areas, but rather a mixed approach with a strong framework of guidance, funding, and overall mitigation at a federal level, and with policy solutions and implementation at a local and state level. Claim 3. Sea level rise is not an issue and does not need to be addressed at a federal level, but only at a local or state level if needed. Singer, 2018, argues that sea level rise is not an alarming issue and argue it has been rising at a steady level and is not related to climate change and rising ocean temperatures, but rather follows a natural trend. Singer, 2018, also attributes the concerns being given solely due to alarmists and states, the sea level has been rising at a steady rate, between 1 and 2 millimeters per year, regardless of ocean temperature. The sea level rose when ocean temperature increased by 0.5 degrees Celsius between 1920 and 1940, but rose at the same constant rate when ocean temperature cooled between 1945 and 1975. Skeptics have also aimed to erase climate change as a whole. Covering Climate Now, 2024, reports, critics are setting their goals at deprioritizing issues such as sea level rise by redacting the words of climate change from bills, as well as removing scientific information regarding the effects of climate change, including sea level rise. Overall, experts with these competing claims would believe a federal approach is not needed and would only need a response at a local and state level, prioritizing a reactive approach. At a local level, it is crucial to involve the community by educating and involving them in combating sea level rise. A useful recommendation includes creating informational forums where citizens can learn and understand the issues that will inevitably face their coastal communities, as this can further hazard mitigation and preparedness. Another useful recommendation at the local level is creating a citizen task force that allows for a more localized approach through further assessments and identifying vulnerable areas. Overall, involving the community is very beneficial as it spreads awareness to citizens and informs them on the urgency of sea level rise and how they can help.
For this slide, it would be on the Miami-Dade approach and how they've been able to help with the sea level rising issue. And this strategy has been adopted in 2015 and has continued to be implemented and changed with the climate change, till today. This approach has been identified 4 special zones that have flooding and excess sea level rise. And this has been more of a place-based approach because it is tried to locally find the risks and really tune into the community input. Overall, they've had workers come to local strategy planning events and have been able to successfully reduce flooding by upgrading storm water drainage systems and converting them into septic systems to prevent groundwater contamination. And they have also been able to ensure that affordable and the underserving communities and the lower income have been able to be safe within the floods and the storms, because some of them are not able to come out of these things or move away, and that's one of the biggest priorities that Miami-Dade has, is because they do have a big lower underserving community in general. Within this entire thing, um, they have been able to gain federal and state grants, as much as 40 million within the Little River AAA um, project, and has been able to use these models to make close predictions for future planning. In general, it's all community based and neighborhood level, because they're really trying to help that community. And in general, they have been able to prioritize the funding for this city. So this approach is for the St. Peter's approach. They have been able to nearly get 633 million over the past 5 years, and have specifically upgraded infrastructure, flood mitigation, and have specifically always addressed community issues and engagement within the flooding crisis. The help that they've been able to get overall is mostly from the federal government, like the Florida Department of Environmental Protection granted them nearly 20 million within the resilience and coastal protection to fund the projects, to keep from flooding and home displacement, as well as being able to use FEMA to support the single family residents to address the flooding and like reallocate if needed. They have been able to grab funding state and locally now, to see by creating a 1% tax for Pinellas County, and it continuously goes for the stormwater improvements, the infrastructure, and the flooding improvements. And other ways that they've been able to contribute is by the stormwater utility fees, as well as creating partnerships, local partnerships like universities and nonprofits, to be able to contribute towards the help within St. Petersburg. And I mean, it also just affects them just as well as it would affect the residents there. And being able to have those over the time being has been able to create such a tremendous help in general. By improving all this stuff, it can prevent severe damage overall, and being able to mitigate entirely with the system enhancements. It will continuously help reduce flooding, improve the stormwater quality, and help with the sea level rise. So this is how St. Petersburg approach has been going, and they have been so far doing pretty well, and the community has also thanked them generously.
Legislation and policy decisions happen at all levels of government. At the federal level, an issue is presented to Congress, either in the House or Senate, as a proposed bill. The bill or problem is given to committees where it is analyzed and the topic is heavily researched. The committee makes adjustments to the bill as a draft, with solutions and recommendations put in place. Then discussion takes place within the legislative body with a vote to pass or to kill the bill. After passing by the first body, the bill moves on to the other side of Congress, either the Senate or House respectively, to go through the same process of committee evaluations and adjustments. It is voted on in the second side of Congress and then sent to the President for approval. If approved, the bill becomes law and is acted. For the state level, the process is almost identical within the State House and Senate, with the exception that it is the governor that approves or vetoes the policy. Similarly, at the local level, a problem is identified and brought to the governing body, usually a mayor and board of commissioners, that work together, sometimes with committees, to develop a solution based on the presented information and enact a policy to attempt to address the problem. Funding is important to consider during decision making as well. Plans can be made, but without funding to put the actions into motion, nothing will get done. Federal, state, and local governments depend heavily on their existing budgets for policy making. Whether it is the budget of the Public Works Department that provides the services, or it's paying for studies to be performed to gather important information. Advocacy organizations can also be utilized with donated funding for policy improvements that align with their organizational mission. Grants also exist at all three levels of government that organizations that gather research can use for funding.
To properly and effectively address Florida's rising sea level, a mixed policy approach is needed at the federal, state, and local levels. Recommendations for policymakers at the federal level include a strong, resilient approach that focuses on proper funding and overall provides a regulatory framework for hazard mitigation. At the federal level, a regulatory framework is needed that would create a standard set of guidelines. This framework would include building codes and land use guidelines, would provide detailed scientific research focused on addressing and combating sea level rise and other climate issues to be addressed, aid in response and rebuilding efforts, and grants in funding the state's efforts, ensuring the states adhere to the framework. By providing a standardized approach at the federal level, it avoids confusion and sets the precedent that the issue of sea level rise must be addressed.
A lead New York City planner who was interviewed in the movie Rising Tide states that federal assistance generally only comes as a reactionary measure in response to major declarations of disaster. But is that true? The National Insurance Act was passed in 1968, more than 50 years ago, establishing the National Flood Insurance Program. The NFIP's primary goals were to reduce future flooding damage and to protect property owners from loss. In 1973, the Flood Insurance Protection Act was passed, which requires homeowners in high-risk flood zones to maintain flood insurance on financed properties. So these measures have been around for over 50 years, and funding associated with the programs has provided local governments with funding for flood mapping, mitigation, and retrofitting. However, some funding measures require damage or repeated damage to qualify, leaving it more reactionary than proactive. Proactive measures often require local funding matches and are often reimbursement programs, placing some necessary work on the back burner or simply out of reach for many communities despite the need.
As previously stated, each state has diverse coastal areas with various components and unique issues, which is why a federal regulatory framework is needed that provides support and regulation, but allows state and local governments to exceed this framework through proper funding and overall tailor it to their states and communities. Beyond federal funding, each state must provide and prioritize funding for a well-rounded approach that focuses on ensuring each city receives a proper response and mitigation. Recommendations for states include providing more assistance in battling sea level rise by creating a state department that focuses on providing support and staffing to cities to battle sea level rise and other climate issues. This would create a more tailored approach, as the department would assign agents to counties to focus on providing proper funding, surveillance, hazard mitigation, and assessing vulnerabilities. By creating a department that ensures each city is getting equal and proper attention on assessing sea level rise, it ensures that the state of Florida is being proactive and focusing on resiliency to battle the issue.
In Florida, Governor DeSantis signed a bill deleting the words climate change from state statutes in May of 2024, reinforcing suppression of data and science that warns leaders that human-influenced climate change is a real and persistent threat to humanity. This change in legislation deprioritized climate solution policy and halted statewide funding for the issue, including research efforts. Fortunately, the Peril of Flood Act, or POFA, signed in 2015 was left untouched, providing reinforcement measures for local municipalities and counties to include sea level rise measures in their state-required comprehensive plans. A study by Butler, Holmes, and Lange provides a snapshot of whether this statewide mandate provides actionable measures for municipality leaders. Their findings offer some positive data showing that such measures may spur activity at the local level, but stop short of action, and the degree to which local governments created meaningful comp plan action items varies widely. Climate gentrification is slated to worsen over time, exacerbating the issue for communities who are already struggling to maintain a basic quality of life. World leaders have come together to meet the challenges of climate change and sea level rise. According to the Institute for European Environmental Policy, more than half of all CO2 emissions since 1751 were emitted since the 1990s. Carbon dioxide, or CO2 emissions, cause the trapping of heat and gases within the Earth's atmosphere and contribute to the greenhouse effect, thus warming the planet. This warming is a key driver of climate change caused by the burning of fossil fuels and industrial processes. The hastening of global warming is not limited to local areas, but is a worldwide issue requiring coordination among worldwide leaders. Internationally, the Paris Agreement was adopted by 196 parties at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in December 2015. This agreement provided for partnering countries to work together toward holding global temperatures rises to no more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, thereby slowing and providing course correction to global warming. Unfortunately, the agreements do not appear to be enough to meet the goals needed to slow global warming. Still, these agreements are the foundation of important policy measures because they place a collective priority on worldwide efforts to slow or reduce the negative effects of climate change with actionable and measurable outcomes that can be monitored. Other agencies, such as the 194-member IPCC, created in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Program, help to provide governments with scientific information that they can use to develop climate policies. These reports and findings also help to provide input in international climate change negotiations. Unfortunately, participation in these types of organizations and even legally binding agreements are vulnerable to politics. For example, President Trump, during his first term in 2017, indicated that he would remove the U.S. from the Paris Agreement and that the U.S. would no longer participate. The removal of the U.S. from the Paris Agreement did not allow for immediate removal and could not take effect until after the next presidential election, which President Trump lost. The new administration under President Biden returned the United States to the Paris Agreement under executive order. The on-again, off-again U.S. participation in the Paris Agreement and worldwide efforts to slow climate change have become a type of political game. With Trump's second term, one of his first actions was to again remove the United States by executive order from the Paris Agreement. This withdrawal will take effect as early as January 2026. Here we can see that politics are essential to collaboration, planning, and response, whether at the local, national, or worldwide levels, leaving response actions as vulnerable as the communities they serve to protect. The most vulnerable cities facing challenges and the effects of sea level rise are now faced with action as necessity. Roads and critical infrastructure like hospitals, power stations, and sanitary sewer systems are affected, leaving citizens without necessary services critical to public health and welfare, and the costs are baffling. Hurricane Sandy, for example, in 2012 cost an estimated $90 billion in damages, leaving the city with the burden of restoring essential services, infrastructure, and property that resulted in unimaginable economic impacts for some smaller communities. Towns and cities on the west coast of Florida were hit hard with coastal flooding and damage during Hurricane Helene in 2024, with reports of storm surge and flooding at more than 20 feet deep. The local governments there were faced with catastrophic damages, and federal help was slow to respond, leaving the communities to face the restoration and response alone. Some communities are less prepared for sea level rise, thinking they are immune to the effects of climate change. Kissimmee, Florida was jarred by the impacts of Hurricane Ian in September 2022, which caused an estimated $112 billion in damages statewide, making it the most costly hurricane in the state's history.
Another global perspective and relevant decision that communities have seen um, be able to accomplish is Bangladesh. Uh, Bangladesh is another country that has implemented a locally led adaptation method, um, and has been shown to be one of the most vulnerable countries in the world due to the climate change and the issues with the sea level rising and flooding. And it has led to millions of people at risk in their country. And it's become a big issue because nearly in 2050, it predicted that 17% of the country would be submerged. And that would lead to nearly 20 million lives either displaced um, or just like deaths in general, because there's nowhere to go in the sense of not being able to move as quick as the climate change. Um, but in this case, they have put it first in their priority to um, create a national strategy that is called the Climate Change Strategy and Plan, and has worked with other global countries like the United Nations and World Bank to receive grant funding. And it has been a big help because they have federally depended on the UN and the community itself because it's locally led. Um, the cities within Bangladesh has determined to do this approach by going kind of by like kind of sort of like Florida, going through the cities and being able to find that approach that fits best in that city, whether it might not be the same everywhere. That's why some of them are more prioritized than others. And in some cases in cities, the best way to navigate is by providing flood shelters, floating schools, and farms, and then also by emphasizing the certain measures for like housing and when building and canal digging to manage water flow in general. So that's one of the another country that has shown a different perspective and decision and how they've been able to attack um, sea level rising. For this slide, I wanted to speak on global perspective and relevant decisions. In general, the sea level rising is a global issue. It's not just a national or a statewide, just for Florida, although that is the basis of this topic. It is entirely a global issue, and many cities have tried to strategize to manage the risks associated with rising sea levels. In general, there are many nations who try to implement strategies, and one of them is the Netherlands. The Netherlands has invested billions of dollars into the national flood defense system, like storm surge barriers, and they even have one project that is called the Room of the River, or Room for the River, that will allow rivers to safely overflow in specific areas when disasters arise, or when like to reduce in general flooding for communities closer to flooding zones. Nearly for the Netherlands, nearly 20 to 30 projects within this project have been completed, which is a huge success and a huge community impact that people have been able to see the differences and have now continued to want to move on to the new stages of reinforcement and renewal, and to keep refreshing the program to still have the same safety standards and to keep up with it. And one of the biggest successes in Netherlands with this project was participate like having municipalities and local inhabitants to participate and be able to gain the billions of dollars with the help of the government as well. And the side benefits of this all have been to improve quality of life and be able to have those recreational areas for people who are looking for better neighborhoods and better communities that may have that, which increase the population in general. It's a great way, and this is a like within the three key things that it allows for with the money have a fairness factor to equate to all the lower income, regular income, single family homes, and having that community stay together and work together allowed for the success within this project for the Netherlands and being able to show other nations that it is possible to implement strategies. You just got to find the ones that work for your nation. So this is what this slide was about.
For policymakers, we would have some recommendations in forms of environmental protection. During flooding, salt water can go into fresh water, causing waterborne illness and mold. For infrastructure resilience, we would like to see future planning for infrastructure to include sea level rise and future projections of those, as well as proper zoning and creating guidelines for those. The other one would be governance and public engagement, and that's getting communities involved in how they can make a difference in sea level rises and giving them further education on the matter.